that we are one race, the human race. And prior to this, I read The Cradle of Humankind by Martin Meredith, Born in Africa, The Quest for the Origins of Human Life. And this book I called The War of the Superstars, because the competition between the groups in finding fossils that would make an impact on the world was unbelievable. We had a group in South Africa, and it started with Raymond Dart, who I'll talk about just now, and is still continuing, and who works in the Cradle for Humankind in the Sterkfontein area of Johannesburg. And then we had the great Rift Valley group, the Leakey family. And the Leakeys, two very driven people, and then their son Richard joined them, and their daughter-in-law joined them, and they've been actually very prolific in their writings about fossils. And then there was a group in Ethiopia, in the Hadar region, led by Alan Johansson of the United States, and that group has also given us a lot of information. But each group wanted to convince the world that the fossils they found were the fossils that actually gave rise to Homo sapiens, that were the forerunners of Homo sapiens. And each group insisted that humankind actually started in the area they were investigating. And so it has been quite a war. I called it a war of the superstars. But it's also a tribute to those who spend their lives in some of the most horrid conditions on earth to seek, find, and share. I think that's amazing. And in this book, Martin Meredith describes people lying on their bellies in the hot sun, in almost desert-like conditions, threatened by predators, threatened by people who live there and don't like what they're doing, risking their lives, and in some instances carefully using toothbrushes to unearth fossils. It is just unbelievable. And one should pay them that tribute. And eventually they've given us something like this, a map. And it's very small, right? But don't worry, I just want to actually give you an idea of where we are. What's the current status of what we found in Africa? And if you have read any evolutionary biology, you'll know that the point of departure between us and the apes was about 6 million years ago. And about 4 million years ago, a skull was found in Ethiopia, Ardipithecus ramidus. Now, they're not terribly sure that that was as close as possible to the ape-human divergence, okay? But the very famous one that came out of East Africa was Australopithecus afarensis, known as Lucy, because when they had unearthed it and they were putting the skeleton together, the song Lucy in the Sky with Glasses was playing by the Beatles on a transistor radio. So they called her Lucy, and she's known as Lucy. She's about 3.3 million years ago, and she was quite a complete fossil. And she was put down as one of the forerunners. But the story gets a little complicated. The turning point in the history of fossil finding is here. Australopithecus africanus, found in South Africa at Taung by Raymond Dart. That finding caused a lot of consternation all over the world, and we'll talk about that. Now we've come here, I've come to the Homo species, so the Homo genus. So all these were Australopithecines. The Homo genus, the most famous one is Homo habilis, that our very own Philip Tobias from Wits, and this is she was about 1.9 million years old. Philip Tobias of Wits described her on behalf of the Leakeys, because Raymond Dart didn't allow him to actually work with fossils. He was teaching anatomy at Wits at that time. And then more recently, Lee Berger comes along and puts Australopithecus sediba there, and they are trying to find some common point which would actually have led up to Homo erectus and then to Homo sapiens. And you can see here in the history of this continent there have been different species who have lived side by side for a long time. And that's where we are today. Homo naledi is not mentioned in this map because it's very recent and its age hasn't been dated as yet. Okay, so where are we? There were two competing ideas of the origins of human beings, the out of Africa idea and the multi-regional hypothesis. Now the out of Africa one sort of supports Darwin's hunch that we were born in Africa, the human race. The multi-regional hypothesis talks about a localized evolution in different parts of the world. Now, that comes about through earlier migrations of Homo erectus, which went and settled in different parts of the world, and they think Homo erectus then gave rise to different races as we see them today. I think out of Africa has won the sort of competition, and I think it's accepted today that we are from Africa. But there were earlier finds, important finds, in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf in Germany in 1856, called Homo neanderthalensis. Then Java by Eugene Dubois in 1891, eventually named Homo erectus, or Java man. Now these finds were a threat to Darwin's hunch that humans originated in Africa. And then in 1908 to 1911, Piltdown Man in southern England, one of the biggest hoaxes in scientific history, because the Europeans would not even dare to believe that anything can come out of Africa, least of all the human race. Darwin's suggestion 40 years before that Africa was the most likely birthplace of humankind was ignored. And in 1953, Piltdown was declared a hoax. Look at the time. Look at the time. Now, I want you to take note of that time. That Piltdown was gradually extracted from the ground between 1908 and 1911, and it was only declared a hoax in 1953. And about 20 years ago, I went to a Royal Society meeting in Cape Town, and Philip Tobias gave us a lecture on the Piltdown hoax. And he went through the various people, the big names in the field of paleontology and anthropology who could have been responsible for that hoax. It was absolutely fascinating. So, there was a great migration 70,000 years ago of a band of Africans of Homo sapiens, us, who then went out into the world, and all of us are their descendants. So that was the connection, that we one race. But the turning point, as I said, was the finding of this skull in Taung, in South Africa, by Raymond Dart, and he called it an ape man. Now the story goes that when this crate of fossils came to Dart's house, he was about to leave for a wedding. He was dressed in his fine suit, and his wife was just getting ready, and they were about to go to a wedding, and then suddenly he disappeared. Somebody brought him this box, and he took it into his cellar, and he opened it, and he was so fascinated. He picked up the skull, and he said, "Wow!" And when she went looking for him, and she found him, he wasn't even aware of the fact that she was there. He was so engrossed in this. So this is Raymond Dart, an Australian scientist who came to South Africa, and he claims that a hominid skull known as the Taung child came from a line of proto-humans, and that was ridiculed by the British scientific establishment. Okay, so Christia herself is a historian. Her book is not about actual fossils. Her book is about the history of fossil finds in South Africa. And she tackles a difficult and complex history admirably. As an 11-year-old, she was awestruck by Jacob Bronowski's BBC documentary, The Ascent of Man. As a history of science undergraduate at Harvard, Kuljian realized that science did not exist in a vacuum and is molded by its social and political context. This leads to deeper questions about the objectivity of scientists as they apply their trade. Africa, more specifically South Africa, the cradle of humankind, with its history of colonialism and legalized racism, is the perfect setting for Kuljian to test her hypothesis. Now, her question was a simple one. Were the scientists influenced by the climes of the times, or by the political climate of the times, in the interpretation of their data? Kuljian asks us to consider the impact apartheid and colonialism could have had on the thinking of scientists studying fossils. How a changing social and political context shaped the search for human origins, and whether scientific attitudes, individual beliefs, and views of race of our most famous anatomists and paleontologists changed with the changing political climate. Okay. Now, people overseas had written of any possibility of Africa being even remotely the cradle of humankind. Charles Darwin's hunch was that it most likely was the cradle of humankind, based on the presence of modern gorillas and chimpanzees on the continent, a view that the Dutch anatomist Eugène Dubois thought had merit, but didn't give up on Asia, where he found Java Man in 1893. So this competition's been going on for a long time. African fossils remains had to be fitted into the taxonomy of race science, since white supremacy had taken hold in science across the world. Okay. And there was the Victorian revolt. The idea that humans were related to an African ape caused an uproar in Victorian England. Descended from apes, my dear, let us hope that it's not true. But if it is, let us pray that it will not become generally known. So how do we connect science to society in a way that is of benefit to society? There's an unequal distribution of science and scientific knowledge. And then I've had a very rich university experience, the University of Cape Town, where I've worked very closely with students for over 3 decades. I've been a warden at one or other residence for 26 years, the longest serving warden UCT has had. I've been a teacher in the academic support program in the health sciences faculty for many, many years. I've been a mentor to students. I've been in postgraduate student support, and eventually the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Transformation. So my life was enriched. And I've had conversations with students, especially during the protests, telling them, don't put a university at risk. This is the hub of learning. This is where intellectual ideas are exchanged. And this is an open space. It might be located at the tip of the African continent, but its winds blow right across the continent and into other parts of the world, and their winds blow right to us here in Africa. And that is particularly important. And I've also had very, very serious discussions with them about Darwin's theory of evolution, because it's the grammar of biology. And their responses have been very, very clear. But need maturity, need further reflection, need further discussion, need further dialogue. And that is what I stood for as Deputy Vice Chancellor of the university, is not to cut off the dialogue with any student, to be able to continue in the interests of developing the mind, because that's what the university is for. The life of the mind is a life worth living. That has been my motto for as long as I can remember. So it was in the context of transformation and decolonization. And what better way to start a discussion, an informal discussion, than talking about Darwin's theory of evolution, talking about the idea of us being one race, talking about the out of Africa theory, and how we are all the descendants of a band of Africans who colonized the world. Now, there's enough proof for that. Darwin didn't really know. He had a hunch. But modern genetics has provided us with lots of evidence that what we are saying is true. So, it was Theodosius Dobzhansky, the notable 20th century geneticist, who once said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Now, the neuroscientist Stephen Rose of the Open University preferred to replace evolution with history. He said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of history. Here, Christia Kuljan treats us to a historical account of the search for human origins, with a rather unusual slant on the attitudes and perceptions of the scientists that have brought to us knowledge of our origins. Now, there's a racist history of our origins. The history of modern-day Homo sapiens is marred by racism. Carl Linnaeus, famous for his classification of living organisms in the 1700s, and Georges Cuvier, the French anatomist, subscribed to polygeneism, the separate creation of races defined on the basis of geography, skin color, and temperament. The Khoisan and the Hottentots of southern Africa were classified as Homo monstrous by Linnaeus, as opposed to monogeneism, in which all of humanity came from a single source, the descendants of Adam and Eve. And we thank Charles Darwin for his dangerous idea, that was Daniel Dennett's terminology, his dangerous idea of evolution by natural selection, a strong case for a unified humanity. And if you read anything today, you'll find that there are in schools, many schools, not only in South Africa but all over the world, even in the first world countries, where teachers don't want to teach youngsters evolution or evolutionary theory. Now, some years ago, I met Janet Brown, who came to Cape Town, to UCT, with Charles Darwin's great-grandson. And she wrote Darwin's Origin of Species, beautifully written book. And Darwin, in his own origin, said, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone on cycling on, according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Okay? Now, a little bit of history about how I got involved here. I was a first-year student at the University of Durban, Westville, and this is Abdul Samad Bemat, who was also a first-year student, and Bemat was a pretty serious student. He was about 10 years older than the normal first-year university student. And of course, every evening after dinner in the residence, what do first years do? They went to walk across to the female residence. And I was one of those, and Bemat he stopped me one night, and I was most irritated with him. And he said to me, have you ever heard of Philip Tobias? And I said, no, who's that? So he says, he's a man I met. He's at Wits. He's a professor there. And he told me the story about how he met Tobias, who at that time was the youngest professor at Wits at the time, in his office filled with books. Bemat felt woefully ignorant when Tobias questioned him about his reading tastes. Outside Tobias's office, Bemat saw a painting of Avicenna, the Arab Ibn Sina, 1980 to 1036 CE, a Muslim physician, scientist, and philosopher, very famous man. Bemat had sparked in me a lifelong interest in Philip Tobias that spans over 4 decades and is still very much alive. It's amazing how these things happen. This is Philip Tobias, who was born in 1925 and died in 2012. Now, at that time, Philip Tobias wrote a little booklet called The Meaning of Race. And in it he said that race was a social construct. And he followed that up with IQ and the nature-nurture controversy. Okay? So, in The Meaning of Race, he said science had offered no confirmation that some races are superior to others. And I was ecstatic. Because at that time, during apartheid, we had protests at that campus every week. In his IQ and the nature-nurture controversy, he suggested that innate differences in intelligence as measured by IQ tests were invalid in an unequal socio-economic environment. I thought he was very brave. I always wondered why the security police didn't pick him up. All this was music to my ears as a young idealist. Here was a white professor at a leading South African institution expressing radical views so bravely in the face of a racist and brutal regime, and more surprisingly, one of a Jewish background. Could you switch that off, please? Acknowledging the Muslim Ibn Sina in face of Israeli-Palestinian tensions. How very amazing that he was on our side, I thought. Kuljan may have somewhat tempered my decades of admiration for Tobias with her deeper analysis of Tobias's confusion about race at that stage. But I am mindful of the cultural and political context of the period covered in history. Tobias asked once, why did I rage against apartheid? Is it of anybody's concern what I believe about the expanding universe or atomic theory? No, they're neutral theories, politically and emotionally. But race is not neutral. Heavily charged emotionally and politically, full of unsound and dangerous meanings. Millions have been murdered, others deprived of basic human rights through racism. In South Africa, it becomes the duty of a scientist who makes a study of race to inform the public of her or his findings in research of race. I shall be failing in my academic duty if I did not say anything. He worked with bones, fossils, and modern anatomy, and they were not black or white. I got to know Philip personally because I reviewed his book, Tobias in Conversation, Genes, Fossils, and Anthropology. And it was reviewed in the South African Archaeological Bulletin in 2010. And then I had to have a long conversation with the author, Philip Tobias. And it was about the use of two words that I had used in that made him keep me on the phone for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Now, reading anything by or about Philip Tobias is a treat. I hope you actually begin to understand that I had acquired, as a first-year university student at that time, a hero. And I followed his life after that quite intensely. The reader is invited to embrace a time span of aeons in which our story and that of our ape and hominid ancestors is condensed in 330 pages. Now, Tobias had a penchant for words, and it irritated a lot of people. When he wrote a reference for somebody and I was chairing the selection committee, to read that letter, I didn't understand half the words that he used. Tobias readily confesses his penchant for words, mixing enlightenment with entertainment. We read of fey characters, like we read previously of dangling particles, offensively split infinitives, ghastly errors of concord, malapropism and other barbarisms in the essays of his students. And then the wisdom of Minerva and an Olympian detachment, together with the distance from the wine of Bacchus, was needed when judging the work of peers, a revelation of the standards this man has set himself as a teacher and a scientist. Okay. He was born in 1925, the year in which Raymond Dart, his predecessor at Wits, announced the Tong fossil to the world. He had a rather sad and unsettled childhood. He wrote an autobiography. He had a sense of justice for others and an interest in the diversity of living things. He lost his sister, an only sibling, from diabetes at a tender age of 21. And that spurred an interest in genetics because his grandmother had diabetes, his maternal grandmother. His mother didn't have it, and then his sister had it. And so that spurred an interest in genetics that eventually produced a PhD on chromosomes in 1953 and his first book on cytogenetics in 1956. He studied the roots of racism in South African genetical thinking with Trevor Jenkins of the Department of Human Genetics at Wits. I had the privilege of meeting Trevor Jenkins the night UCT gave me the Distinguished Teacher Award and gave him an honorary doctorate. So we sat together and I sort of had a long chat with him. The sense of social justice made Tobias become the president of NUSAS in 1948 as an undergraduate. He was involved in the return to South Africa of the remains of Sati Baartman. He showed that the San, like the rest of humanity, had 46 chromosomes, which is a serious blow to racist thinking. He regularly protested for 40 years against the apartheid government's exclusions of blacks from universities, and with others brought to account those responsible for the untimely death of the black consciousness leader, Steve Biko. And I said to you, he became really famous for actually describing the skull Homo habilis for the Leakeys. They found it in the Great Rift Valley. And there's a lot of criticism about it until very recently, because they felt that the Leakeys, who were pretty persuasive, forced Tobias into actually classifying this fossil into the genus Homo. Okay? So I said, this is a true Renaissance man. It's the story of a true Renaissance man, one who regrets the rarity of such individuals in the age of specialization. It would appeal to both the general reader, the specialist, and anyone interested in our origins. The work is important in that it is a record of the thoughts of one of South Africa's great academic minds, reflecting on a past that is rich and varied beyond imagination. But there were other giants, and I put giants in inverted commas for a reason, which you'll understand in a minute. So other giants contributed to understanding of evolution today, and who played a significant role in the shaping of Tobias's career and thinking. And Dart was one of those. And Tobias succeeded him as chair of anatomy in 1959. And according to Tobias, he was a huge admirer of Dart, the only qualified person in the world to recognize the Tong skull as an ape man. Dart's strong typological approach to variation in humans and his habit of making comments such as, you've got a smidgen of Negro there, or a little bit of bush in that one space, made discomforting reading despite the scientific value of such studies. Okay? So, Tobias talks about his love for students, the pride he took in their careers, his friendship with Mary Leakey, because they sought clues in old bones and also liked reading detective novels, and they felt that they were detectives unraveling a crime. There is something for me about the sand, which forms an interesting synthesis of genetics, biochemistry, and politics, and one is left in excited anticipation of the account of Littlefoot, one of the most complete Australopithecine skeletons ever discovered. Now, this racism in science, let's just go into a bit of a history. Racism and racist classification persisted late into the 20th century with scientists like Carlton Kuhn, whose work was applauded by the segregationists in the USA and picked up by scientists in the 1960s in South Africa, despite Darwin and the emerging modern genetics. Then as late as 1994, when we got our freedom here, in the very year of our political freedom, Bernstein and Murray of Harvard published a bell curve in which they suggested that there were racial differences in intelligence. More shocking and recent were the remarks made in 2007 by James Watson, one of the people who actually worked out the structure of the DNA molecule, that Africans were of lesser intelligence. Watson, together with Crick, discovered the structure of the DNA molecule in 1953, for which they received the Nobel Prize. And DNA is a 4-base alphabet which connected all living organisms, including animals and plants. All living forms were related through DNA, and yet Watson revealed such a racial prejudice more than half a century later, well into the 21st century. Raymond Dart, well, there was a question mark on him as far as Christia was concerned. Dart disagreed with Gertrude Caton Thompson that Great Zimbabwe was an African achievement, or that Mapungubwe developed without the influences of superior races in Asia. Dart was in the habit of commenting on the features of others with remarks. I just told you that. In the Kalahari, he and his colleagues employed the most demeaning of practices on women, measuring the external genitalia, a practice shared by Philip Tobias, Hertha de Villiers, and Trevor Jenkins, and steatopegia, the accumulation of fat on the buttocks of females, behavior reminiscent of the sexual obsession Europeans held of African women in the 1600s. Whilst not belittling the huge contributions South African scientists have made, and I want to actually emphasize this, that there are huge contributions to the knowledge of human origins that hold us in very good stead internationally, Christia Kool-Jan brings a different perspective to the reader about these pioneering individuals. That our journey to the acceptance that the ancestry of humanity is African and that all of humanity is one race has been an arduous one. Richard Leakey was aghast that people think they are different from each other. And so during apartheid, whenever Philip Tobias invited Richard Leakey to South Africa, he refused to come. This perspective is probably the first of its kind, in which the reader is given an insight into the minds and notions of those behind the science and their shocking perceptions about those communities they studied. It is both the scientific methodology employed in their studies and the prejudiced mindset of the scientists that Kuljian had brought so clearly to the attention of the reader. The paradox is that whilst we, as South Africans, bask in the glory of the birth of humanity in Africa, the ill feeling and distrust created by apartheid and in the present racist environment have initiated a backlash to aspects of the theory of origins. So the theory of origins, the scientific theory, is suffering because people don't want to accept it. Facial reconstructions of fossils with ape-like features such as Homo naledi have justifiably brought forth sensitivities in those in whom the offense of being likened to apes by racists have run deep over the centuries. This is the politics of science, Christian Gulchan says, which needs to be addressed and negotiated carefully to grow the science and to promote equality on the basis of the facts about our common humanity, thus creating, as my friend, my very good friend, Professor Alan Morris says, a new vision of the future. I think we can use science and scientific findings to create a better society. You can accuse me of scientism. So that's Homo naledi, and that's Lee Berger kissing his find. But you see, the reconstruction of the face makes people feel very uncomfortable. And then Tobias had a program in the 90s called Tobias's Bodies. This kind of picture also raised a few objections. But 1924 was a watershed moment in the history of human origins, with the discovery by Raymond Dart of the tongue skull Australopithecus africanus. Tobias succeeded Dart as chair of anatomy and claimed that Dart was the only qualified person to see it. Now, Dart ensured that the glory of the find was his. He gave a little bit of credit to a young schoolgirl, Josephine Sammons, who actually suggested to Dart to explore fossils in Tong. The refusal by the Europeans to recognize Dart's find could be interpreted as jealousy about its African origin. I cannot tell you how Dart was demeaned and insulted for his find. Dart used to take the Australopithecus fossil to an international conference, and they used to put it aside, and they used to bring the Piltdown Man, put him there, and talk more about that, and not talk about Dart's findings. At a conference in London attended by Smith Woodward, Dart's mentor, Grafton, Elliot Smith, and Sir Arthur Keith, the focus was on Piltdown Man and not on the Australopithecus skull. And yet this was the real skull. This was the genuine skull. This is what changed the trajectory of thinking in evolutionary biology. So there was a belief amongst these scientists that the African was a separate race, subhuman, and a divergence from the white Caucasian prototype. According to Raymond Dart, South Africa harbored the pre-human stock from which the human race itself derived. That's what Kuljian tells us. A curiosity that would throw light on links between primates and human beings, in this case read as the status of those of white origin. For those who celebrated the national and international standing of the research into our origins here in South Africa, only to learn that the history, the methodology, and thinking behind these studies was inhumane and racist, it comes as a rude shock. Here was the man, Robert Broom. He was a Scottish-born paleontologist at work in the field in South Africa. His discoveries supported Dart's claims and helped establish Australopithecines as a significant category of human ancestors. Broom was a doctor, and he went and searched for fossils, always dressed in his jacket, his waistcoat, and his tie. Now, Dart's ideas on evolution and race were influenced by the British, and he was trained in the tradition of comparative anatomy, which based racial differences on physical traits. prior to this, Robert Broom, who was the friend of the future Prime Minister Jan Smuts, who accepted evolutionary theory, but also believed that races were separate creations. And I asked here, whatever happened to Darwin's idea of speciation? Amassed a huge collection of skeletons to prove his theory, exchanging these with scientists overseas. Broom was thrown out of so many fossil hunting sites because he didn't obey the law, he never sought a permit, and every time he got thrown out, he came back, or he would phone Jan Smuts and say, get me a permit again. In retrospect, we read with horror of the naked racial practices of Broom in his scientific quest to learn about other races, of skulls being boiled in his kitchen besides a pot of soup, or of the procurement of a pure Korana skeleton through devious means, and the general and complete absence of any human feeling towards a bushman whose only worth was her or his skeleton for overseas markets, because its anatomy could offer a clue to the relationship between apes and humans. Daniel Moshele, who was his trusted aide, was to Broom my chief native assistant, Daniel, a fossil hunter worth his weight in gold. There was an urgent need in Britain for an accurate account of the natives of South Africa for scientific use and a historical record. So South Africa has historically been plagued by racial classification and discrimination. It is ironic that this is one of the foremost regions of the world with respect to the study of our origins. And yet, after our political freedom in 1994, we're still grappling with racial issues, racism and discrimination. And in my opinion, one of the answers to that is we got to teach evolution in schools. The year 1913 gave us three major events. The Native Land Act dispossessed the majority of South Africans of their land. The discovery of Piltdown Man in Britain, which was a hoax, which stole Dart's thunder, diminishing the impact of his discovery of the Tongue skull in 1924. Nothing good can come out of Africa. And thirdly, the finding of a hominid skull, a single find at Boskop, from which scientists created a prototype on which was based the idea of a Boskop race, a foundation of a race typology that sought a particular archetype for each race, an idea that survived until the mid-20th century. It is this idea that drove the research of Broom, Dart, and Tobias. A prototype. It was used to explain variation in the phenotype of the various African races and influence the politics of the time, which declared whites as the superior race and that Africans could not live on equal terms with white people. Now, Ronald Singer, an anatomist at UCT, rightfully complained that a race was created on the basis of a single find. But our thanks, our gratitude should go to Professor Herta de Villiers of Wits, who initiated a paradigm shift away from typology, declaring that there were no distinguishing features between different tribes in African populations in southern Africa, but a range of variation in a cluster of closely related populations, in a book in 1968 based on her PhD and entitled The Skull of the South African Negro. Thankfully, a synthesis had begun in the mid-1940s between Darwin's idea of evolution and natural selection and genetics, the science of heritability of traits. This was a new direction in biological thinking and was born here. Okay? Now, even more heartbreaking is the account of Keri Keri, a young woman whose bones and face mask were added to Dart's collection at Wits after her death, procured in a manner just too ghastly to contemplate. Kuljan tells us that the reader is left to wonder how her family had agreed to this bizarre agreement. Brendan Billings, the curator who had oversight to the Wits bone collection, initially an admirer of Dart's, upon reflection, couldn't help but conclude that Dart was a racist. To what extent were people like Dart, Broom, Smuts, and even Tobias victims of the prevailing political culture of segregation of their times? We see a human side to Dart over the cerebral palsy of his son, Galen. Dart only cried when his son was ill. As shocking as these revelations are, we are grateful to Christia Kuljan for our honesty as we grapple with our past to create a better future. So Tobias's thinking in the early years regarding race was a blow to the image I had of him for decades. Now this is me. His scientific approach was similar to Dart's, and he hesitated in dropping the idea of the post-cop race. His ideas on race lacked clarity and seemed contradictory. On the one hand, he opposed apartheid in support of human rights, and on the other, he displayed unwholesome scientific practices, which revealed a preoccupation of the private parts of Khoisan women. As late as 1978, it was preposterous that he still referred to people as living fossils. That's what Kuljan says, since they did not represent the survival of an otherwise extinct species. He reverted to type when discussing race and felt that race was necessary to bring order to variation in human populations. Griqua remains that were exhumed were not returned, but claimed after 1996, something not mentioned in his autobiography. But Tobias's views evolved with time. To his credit, he felt that there was no scientific basis for hierarchies in different races. He is to be credited with the identification and naming of Homo habilis, which now is being accepted, perhaps the ancestor of Homo florensis. For the Leakeys, his membership of NUSAS as an undergraduate in 1948, his efforts to have the remains of Sarah Baartman returned, his efforts on behalf of the Steve Biko inquest, his work on the SAN was a serious blow to racist thinking. He stated in 2002 that exploitation of alleged racial superiority has no scientific basis. Positive outcomes. There were huge social implications of these amazing finds. Displays of fossils at the Transvaal Museum by John Robertson were met by resistance from the apartheid Christian government. The idea that our Australopithecine... I must tell you a little story. I used to go to conferences in Pretoria, the Surgical Research Society, and I got to know and befriended quite a few of the staff at the University of Pretoria. And one of the very senior surgeons, who I think was at the head of the department at one stage, said to me, "Anwar, what are you doing this afternoon?" And I said, whenever I go to London, I go to the Natural History Museum and I look at the cast of the Australopithecine skull. But the real one, the original one, is here in the Transvaal Museum. I want to go and see it. And he looks at me and says, "Are you mad? Are you an evolutionist? You're crazy. Have you not read the Quran? You're a Muslim, man. You're created by God." And I always say to him, "No, it's another view." And he says, "No, it's rubbish. Me, I believe in Jesus Christ." It's actually quite... So the idea that Australopithecine ancestors were violent and butchered each other, we owe to Dart, whilst its popularization was due to Robert Ardrey and Arthur C. Clarke, amongst others. What a relief that these ideas were strongly countered by the likes of Bob Brain and Elizabeth, how do you say this? Brabha. Man is born in adversity, who studied the effects of climate changes on evolution, whilst our very own Alan Morris at UCT contextualized the lives of ancestral species. In the realm of literature, Bruce Chatwin idealized a view of a peace-loving humanity in The Songlines, an idea that evolutionary psychologists would disagree with. But there's a happy ending to every story. The third part of this account somewhat reads like a happy ending. The long overdue repatriation ceremony of the Greek skeletons. There's an echo here. Is there? Can you hear me? Is it an aeroplane? Okay. The long overdue repatriation ceremony of the Greek skeletons, the declaration of the Sterkfontein Valley as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO at a time when our fledgling democracy was taking off, the work of Himla Sudial with the geneticist Jenkins in the era of mitochondrial DNA, the thinking around mitochondrial Eve and a Y chromosome Adam, and the welcome resolution of the out of Africa versus the multi-regional theory were all good news. Darwin's hunch is realized, and humanity is declared African and won. These are watershed moments not only in the story, but in the history of the human race too. Strangely, Tobias was not easily convinced, but the tide of opinion in favor of the out of Africa hypothesis grew. At about this time, Ron Clark's fossil was actually exposed, and I wrote a letter to Sunday Independent. I was reading the Independent, and there was an article by a woman called Heather Dugmore, who wrote an article about Ron Clark's fossil on the discovery of Littlefoot. And it was so nicely rounded off by a comment by a visitor to the cave. Her name was Christine Reed. And her somber reflection was that despite the phenomenal increase in knowledge of who we are and where we come from, we still lead a very shallow existence. And I went on to say that it is a sad fact that only a select few engage with what science is unearthing about our origins, the brain, consciousness, and genetics. We live in a celebrity culture, immersed in materialism, and many of us are sadly indifferent to the amazing and awesome world around us that science and other disciplines are revealing to us. Ron Clark, Philip Tobias, Louis Leakey would never earn the salary or have the fame of a British footballer. And it's sad. And here's Ron Clark with the Littlefoot fossil, which is one of the most complete fossils which has now been classified as an Australopithecine. And the story is that his two assistants, Stephen Motsumi and Kwame Molefe, were given the bones of the foot and said, go and find this fossil. And they did. And Tobias then stated, I am an African. This is a story of how far we have come. Not only from the deepest of time in terms of our ancestry, but as a nation who grappled with the inhumanity of apartheid and racism of the 20th century, compounded with the scientific endeavors to declare African populations separate and inferior. Apartheid is dismantled in 1994, and in 2002, our icon, now this is a review I wrote, and I should have said my icon, Philip Tobias, introduces himself on television with, hello, my name is Philip Tobias, and I am an African. We're all African because this was our cradle. We were all born here in this great continent. Darwin's hunch becomes fact, and Tobias's evolution with respect to his thinking is complete. And that is such a nice ending. It reminds me of Richard Dawkins, who came back to his native Kenya, and the museum which housed the fossils was next door to a church, and he bumped into the pastor of the church who was going in to do a ceremony on a Sunday morning, and he said, hi, I'm Richard Dawkins, and I'm descended from the apes of Africa. And the pastor didn't take kindly to it. So, and this is a great and honest piece of work. Highly recommended, which should be part of discussions in all our classrooms, in high schools and tertiary institutions on science, race, decolonization, and transformation as we envision a new South African society. Now, I said recently, I've been talking to you all week about physics and how it underlies everything. Physics explains much, but not everything. Remember, Siri Hustvedt yesterday asked, does physics explain dreams? And that is why somebody asked me in the week about the relationship between science and spirituality, and I thought I'll just actually tell you a little bit about this book by Ursula Goodenough. Ursula Goodenough is a scientist at the University of Washington. And as a child, her father used to always ask her, Ursula, why do people believe in God? But then she said, when her father was dying, he prayed. So Ursula went to university and she registered for zoology. And she said it changed her life. And she began to actually love science. But whenever she went home, she went with her friends to the church that she used to attend. And she says she used to sing in the choir, and then her friends who still lived in that little town said, Ursula, join us and sing with us in the choir. And she says she used to sing in the choir, but she didn't seem to have the experience her friends were having. She looked around and they had a look of deep contentment on their faces. And she says, why do I not feel this contentment? Why do I not feel anything for a scripture that was written 2,000 years ago? And yet my friends look so happy, look so relaxed, look so serene. And then she realized, she says, no, I do have a source of happiness, and that is my science. So 2,000 years after the scriptures, there is something that is still evolving, and that's knowledge. And every day we're learning something about this universe, which fills us with awe and wonder through the science. A feeling of appreciation. Wow, look at that massive, beautiful lion in the bush. And that, she says, gives her a sense of spirituality. So her science, for her, is a spiritual experience. Then she goes on to discuss religion, and she says organized religion she has left behind. But she says that despite people having different religions, different philosophies, different ideologies, we need one common narrative. Remember yesterday Siri Husfit spoke about the importance of a narrative. And the common narrative is that we are all stardust. We are all born of stardust. That's the common narrative. And she says that science provides the evidence for this. And if we consider our common origin in the cosmos, and we consider that we have all evolved, like Darwin has described, and modern genetics have proved, we will probably get along better with each other. So, what place for God? In my atomic theory, in one of the talks I gave some years ago, I said, what are the consequences of atomic theory? Is there a sense of spirituality? Michael Shermer asks, what's his place for God? Think about it, and it fills you with awe and wonder. Then what's your spiritual experience? A bridge between religion and science? Does science bring an austerity to reality? Philip Tobias told me over the phone that he said to Richard Dawkins in his house in Oxford once, you are taking out the mystical aspect of this universe by being over-scientific. I don't know what Dawkins replied to that. Some people say naturalize the deity. God is our chosen name for the ceaseless creativity in the natural universe, biosphere and human cultures. If reductionism leaves us as nothing but particles in motion, then only brute facts exist in reality. But the agency that arises with life brings value, meaning, and action in the universe. Blind forces of physics gave rise to purposeful, thinking, meaningful, moral, and conscious beings who in turn marvel at the blind forces of physics. Walt Whitman says, I believe in a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars. And the pismire is equally perfect, and a grain of sand, and the egg of the wren. And the tree toad is how do you say this? Chef d'oeuvre for the highest, and the running blackberry would adorn the parlors of heaven. And the narrowest hinge in my hand puts to scorn all machinery, and the cow crunching with depressed head surpasses any statue, and a mouse is miracle enough to stagger sextillions of infidels. This is my reference to this for my review of Darwin's Hunch. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Okay. Now, I know I've been told again today that I've been very naughty and have not made a reading list. Midi over there will get my reading list in the week. I am anticipating an extremely busy week this week, but I'll try and get it done. Send it to Midi. We'll put it on the website. And you can all have it. Okay?